Hi, I'm Jonathan Treussard, and welcome to Treussard Talks, where we talk about the mechanics of investing, the psychology of investing, and what it means to manage your wealth with purpose. Because understanding your wealth shouldn't be as complex as building it. Welcome to today's show. E02 Dwyer, thanks for being on the show today.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Jonathan, for inviting me.
You played a huge role in my professional life early on. I think this probably is a little bit of a fictionalized story with, the 15 years that separate the events from now. Mm-hmm. But the most memorable day for me of 2008 was probably the fall of Lehman. You were at the central nervous system of a very large, very sophisticated family office in New York. And my recollection of the day is you being on your phone and being on the BlackBerry all day, basically tracking wires. So that's my 2008. Before we dig into your history and all of that, what would you say was your most memorable day in 2008?
I will say it's sort of it's sort of a happy story in some ways. I remember it was a Sunday that it was announced that Lehman was filing for bankruptcy. And I was actually home with my daughter, who was 6 years old at the time. And my husband was traveling in Asia. So I went up to my daughter, and it was probably 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. And I said, Mommy's going to have to go into the office because we were, I didn't explain this to her, but we were very interested to see what happened to Asia in the Asia Open. And so I said, Mommy has to go to the office and you're going to have to come with me. And I remember she looked up at me and she said, today is the best day of my life.
Oh, I love that.
But we went to the office, and you remember the trading desk. We had this big trading desk, must have been like 4 or 5, trading seats. And we all stood around, the Asia trader watching Asia Open, which actually, by the way, it was actually a pretty calm open. Things really didn't go crazy after the Lehman bankruptcy until that Tuesday. So it was Sunday, Monday was actually pretty calm as people were trying to assess what was happening or going to happen. But I remember she was skipping around the trading desk, like just having a grand old time in the face of all this sort of anxiety and craziness. So it was sort of, for me, that was a very special memory for me. It then went on. By Tuesday, everyone realized how bad this bankruptcy was going to have in terms of its ripple effect across the financial markets. And then things really got to be crazy.
I love that story, and thanks for sharing it, because I think it does speak to, in the middle of crises, in the middle of craziness, it's your personal life, it's the human aspect, it's your kids who eventually, kind of ground you and give you a sense of clarity, which I find is incredibly important. So I love that story. But before we got to 2008, can you take us back to how it all began, your life story, and how you got into this industry?
Yeah. And I think I've mentioned this to you before, and I mentioned this to many, particularly young people, that, I actually didn't start in the financial industry at all until I was 29. So it took me a while to find what I really enjoyed doing. As you know, I actually studied physics as an undergrad at Harvard. That's what I got my BA in. But I realized I wasn't made for the academic life, but I didn't know what I was going to do. So I actually worked as a paralegal, which I highly recommend. You learn a lot about the legal process, but I worked as a paralegal for 2 years. Then I worked doing some consulting, which I learned how to make PowerPoints. I learned how to write memos, things that people hate to do, but you need that kind of practice to really develop that skill. And I really valued, for my 5 years, working for a small consulting firm up in Boston. And it was then after that I moved to New York City, didn't have a job, and fell in with a friend who was launching a hedge fund. Although I don't think we called it a hedge fund back then. This was 1994. We were actually a commodity trading advisor, a CTA. We traded futures and currency forwards, sort of a lot of macro type products, although this was a systematic trading program. And so I didn't know much about the macro stuff. I couldn't tell you how many barrels of oil were in a crude oil contract, but we traded them using pretty early quantitative models. And that's how I got started in the industry. I started as a trader and a programmer, but I really found I was more interested in how the information was flowing in terms of our trading activity. And we were a small office and someone needed to manage the operations. And, also then I moved more into risk. And that's really where I found my calling, I guess you'd say, that maybe I'm a pessimist by nature. I don't think I am, but I definitely didn't like the trading environment. You were wrong generally about 50% of the time. So, but I liked risk and thinking about how you could position yourself to not get too surprised when there's like big shocks to the market. So I moved more into a risk role. Actually, you and I both worked with Robert Ziff, and he loved this story. So I became the risk manager at this small PTA, and I kept a hammer in my desk, like a hammer, like a big hammer, I have 1 foot long hammer. And when I felt that the guys were putting on positions that had too much risk, I would go out to the trading desk with my hammer.
That's one way to enforce trade limits and risk limits. I love it.
And these were back in the days when you had phones on the desk and you pick up the phone and put in the order. Nobody does that anymore, but back in the day, so I'd stand behind them and say, "Don't touch that phone," with my hammer. And we called it the risk hammer. And it was an expression that I used even in my days after leaving the CTA. I went to Ziff Brothers Investments, which is where you and I met. But we'd use that expression of like, do we have to take out the risk hammer?
I love it.
And I started at Ziff Brothers in risk, and then as I moved into a CFO role, which really was more of an operational role, because in the end, you really can't do risk if you don't have good data. So it was all about how do we make sure for a very broad, diversified portfolio, primarily in equities, but covering all sorts of products. And so making sure we were tracking everything accurately was so critical. And I worked a lot on putting those systems and processes together. So, and then after 14 years at Ziff Brothers, I went to Morgan Stanley I was there for about 4 years, which wonderful experience, met some wonderful people there, but I found I was not made for such a large firm. Ziff Brothers, at one point we had several hundred employees, and that was the largest firm I had ever worked with. So going to a large investment bank was a big shock, and I realized that was not
your environment.
The right thing for me. Yeah. So now, as you know, I work as an independent consultant, helping generally smaller investment firms think about risk and operation.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that entire arc. And again, there is so much in there. I mean, I want to go back and talk about everything, but I think your point is right, which is it's the more complex journeys tend to teach you more, right? And teach you about how important it is to have a kind of multidisciplinary background to actually do this well, and to be a paralegal. We all know, sometimes the drudgery, the boring stuff is where ultimately things really matter. And then, the risk hammer thing. I mean, I think that's so interesting, right? Because in a lot of ways, particularly, even in a quote unquote systematic environment, you can't be always programmatic. Sometimes you have to do the override. And I guess your hammer was the ultimate override, right? So that's...
it was a figure. I mean, I can assure you I never actually hit anyone with that. But, it was to say, like, let's take a step back and think about what the risks are here. And, look, and I will say sometimes maybe you could say the risk hammer got overridden, and that was okay. But it was really the symbol of, it was to signify, like, we need to have a little bit of thought around it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. The other Katie in my life, my Katie Sherrod, who was my boss at Research Affiliates. And we talked a lot about culture, and we talked a lot about decision making. And of course, decision making in a normal business environment is tricky, but it moves at a slower pace than it does on a trading desk, right? Obviously. But one of the things we talked about a lot was this concept of again, the fact that decision making is messy and you have to get all the yuck out on the table, right? You have to be willing to talk about kind of the ugly stuff. And if you have the right culture, that's the way to do it, right? So I'm sure no one actually felt threatened by the hammer, but it was a marker. I'm going to assume that no one felt threatened by the hammer, but it was a marker of like, wait, we need to have a harder conversation. I'd love to hear if you have experience kind of backing this up, but I suspect that the people that are unwilling to have the hard conversations, the people that are always kind of aye, captain, at some point, the lack of diversity of thinking and just kind of not thinking about things from different angles usually kind of bites you.
Yeah, I would say, even there's the people who are, you're right, the aye captain, they're following following orders, so to speak, or following policies, and but I think the other side also is sometimes people can be really stubborn, and I don't mean, I think that's a natural, a natural tendency for all of us. You get so attached to a particular view, and it can be really hard to take a step back, and I think that's one of the roles of risk is to think about, okay, well, what are we anchoring on that maybe isn't the case anymore? What are the new data points that might lead us to change our viewpoint? And I think that can be sometimes, it might not happen in a single conversation. It might have to be multiple conversations where you're sort of incorporating all new information and new data points into your overall strategy. And it is an iterative process.
Yeah, no, it's hard. And again, it might not be exactly physics, but there's something to, what mathematicians talk about Bayesian updating and all of that, right? Which is,
that's a good example.
You have to be able to say, well, this was my prior. Now we have new information. To what extent should that information actually be reflected in the new set of beliefs? And I think it's really hard, right? Because the mathematics are easy, but in the real world, you don't know the weight of the new data point. Is it actual information? Is it just a glitch? We're recording this and we'll be releasing it shortly in the wake of early April 2025. But we had something that just resembled like a 9 sigma day, right? A 9 standard deviation day. That one happened to be to the upside. But then you're wondering, is this the new distribution of stock returns, or is this just, how do we deal with that? I mean, by the way, sincerely think that anybody dealing with quantitative analysis and just thinking about the world as it is, as opposed to the way people think it should be, will be looking back on this and just scratching their heads like, how much is this the new world, right?
Yeah, and in some ways we really won't know, right? We'll only know it in history. I always think when some of these things happen, I always think like, I can't wait to read the book about this, but that's going to be 20 years from now. And you'll have a lot more understanding when you're looking back in that context. But I did actually want to mention, just in terms of thinking about like physics and, and it's really, it's noise. There's so much noise, and you hear about this all the time from investors, is filtering out the noise from the fundamental, I don't want to call them truths, but the fundamental elements that need to be watched. And, that's a huge challenge for investors, but it's also a challenge on the risk side of thinking about how much is just sort of random volatility that happens. There's a famous expression, Six Sigma events happen all the time. And it's important to remember that, even though technically it's a rare event, particularly in things like the stock market or any financial market with the fat tails, Six Sigma is not as rare as what we think of when we say, from a statistical standpoint, what Six Sigma means.
Right. And that's why risk is so important. Risk management is so important, because in a world in which actually the unexpected, the extreme unexpected happen on a more regular basis than you would like it to, then you have to be ready for it. Obviously, we started touching on this, but one of the things that I love to explore is really two different topics: the mechanics of investing and the psychology of investing. And the mechanics of investing, I find, are often overlooked, because we all walk around kind of assuming the plumbing works, and we all walk around, it would be impossible to get in the car every morning and start wondering how the combustion engine kind of goes about its business. And do you have instances where you would say, at that particular point or in that particular circumstance, the mechanics, perhaps it's the plumbing of investing becomes the overriding concern?
I was thinking about that question, and I think one thing that really came out for me, and it was from actually the financial crisis, but not just the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, but probably pretty much every financial crisis that has occurred in my lifetime in the industry. And that really is how much relationships matter. And that's your relationships with, when you're an investor, you are dealing with counterparties who are holding your assets, trading your assets, holding your cash. I think you mentioned during the financial crisis, I did spend a lot of time moving money around and focusing on getting assets into safe harbors, safe locations. And a lot of it was I needed to know who to call, and I needed to have a relationship with someone who would want to help me. And I think that, we think of the investing industry as, dog eat dog, everybody against each other, but it actually is not. I think particularly on the mechanics of it, you can need to do something. And yes, you should be able to do it, but you may need someone to pick up the phone and help you or, put through an approval. And if you don't have a relationship with someone values you as a customer, they'll get to it, but you may not be the first one on the list. And that, I will say, I think we made an effort when I'm working, with you at Zip Brothers, we really made an effort to treat our counterparties well. We viewed it as a partnership. It was we benefited from their services. They benefited from charging us fees. But what it was it was a partnership. And so when the financial crisis hit, we were able to get through to people who were crazy busy. They probably had eight lines ringing at the same time. And, it was an investment, really. We had invested in those relationships. And I think people think that this doesn't matter because it's all on computers now, but it still does matter. And so knowing who your counterparties are, who are the people who know you, I make a big effort. So all the people I deal with in terms of my own investing, I'm talking to them regularly. And not about, I want to know how their business is going.
Right.
And what are the challenges they face, because I want them to know that I'm there, like it is a partnership, that we are in this, in this business together. And it does matter quite a bit. And that was true. I was there for the .com crisis, and then obviously the COVID crisis, the same, all of these things that occur, and knowing who to call to help you with a transaction is still critically important.
No, and I think that's right. And again, it's one of those things where with the advent of more and more technology, in a lot of ways, you get fewer bites at the apple in terms of actually making connections and rapport. When you are trading over the phone, well, you're talking to that person, and there is and you can,
they know you.
They know you. And by the way, they know your tone and your inflections, and you hear their inflections, and when they're kind of stressed, but ultimately this concept of your word is your bond. Well, the words are actually spoken on an ongoing basis. As we move away from that, then it's again, you're moving those interactions, to use a statistical sense, a term, you're moving those interactions to the tail, right? You're only calling them when it's extraordinary, and that's not a good situation.
Right. So, so I will say, I think that that's something that's still an important part of the business. I think the other thing that doesn't get enough attention is liquidity. I mean, it's a perfect time to be discussing this, because liquidity is not how liquid is your stock portfolio, because you may not be able to or want to sell your stock portfolio at a particular time where you need to have access to cash. So I think it's thinking about, how much liquidity you have outside of your, what I would call sort of more volatile investments. Do you have, fixed income products that have liquidity? But I think people, I see it sometimes that when I'm talking to people who are in family offices, they often feel like they actually don't have a lot of money because their assets are all locked up. And, if you're in private equity or private credit, looking at these liquidity terms, which can be quite restrictive, it's very important because those are assets you may not have access to for years and years and years. So,
No, I think that's exactly right. And again, as we look at the volatility that we've experienced and are experiencing, people were, and I think people were rightly concerned about what was going on in the treasury market during, kind of the meltdown, the equity meltdown that we just experienced. And I think we see this every time around, right? Which is, the way I described it in my latest newsletter is safety is one thing, but liquidity is something else altogether, right? And so, when your stocks are down 20%, when your kind of high risk portfolio is down 20, 30, 40%, if you're an irrational investor, you're also just dying to get out of there. But if you're trying to be a rational investor, you're saying, I need liquidity. Well, I'm not going to sell the thing that's down 40%, so I'm going to sell the thing that's down 2%, and that might be your treasuries. That's a huge part of it. And I think there is evidence that the treasury market isn't nearly as liquid as one would think it is, so that kind of compounds onto itself. And the other thing that I think is very important to explore in what you just described is, particularly when it comes to not so much private equity, but private credit, because it's become kind of a new phenomenon, even though it's a new phenomenon, 20 years in the making, 16 years in the making. It is functionally lending against a set of assets, and it's lending that was moved away from the banking system by edict. We said, "Hey, banks, don't do this."
Necessity. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But now we have now investors have taken the place of traditional banking operations, and as a result of that, the idea that there's liquidity when you need it. No, you're in it. You're in it for the whole ride.
Yeah. And so, and I think, and we saw this, again, in the financial crisis, this concept of gates. It's interesting, that word, I don't think I ever heard that word in a financial context, so, 2008, 2009. And suddenly all these gates came up and people couldn't access, even, with 3 months, 6 months liquidity that, holdings that they thought had at least some medium-term liquidity. So I think thinking about what exactly are the liquidity terms for each investment is so important.
And you hesitated to use the word truth earlier. I'm going to hesitate to use it now. But there is perceived liquidity and there is true liquidity, right? And even at the most liquid end of the spectrum, the reason money market funds ran into trouble in '08 is because everybody thought they had infinite liquidity, when of course infinity isn't a real thing in the world that we live in.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. I'm Jonathan Treussard, founder of Treussard Capital Management. I hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to start receiving my free newsletter, Wealth Empowered, or if you'd like to learn more about me and Treussard Capital Management, go to Treussard.com. That's TREUSSARD.com. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the episode. All right, so let's talk about the psychology of markets, the psychology of investing. I find learning from extremes so insightful. What would you say are some of the wackiest behaviors and things you've seen in markets from a psychological standpoint?
Well, I don't know if it's psychological, but it was definitely, this was one of the things I really remember from a risk perspective in the financial crisis. I'm sure you remember this, that when this all, everything, I think it was after the Lehman bankruptcy, but people started to realize just how much, leverage and unsecured lending had been going on, that there were bonds, more so in Europe, that went from AAA to junk overnight.
Yeah.
And you could argue that's just not possible, and I think one of the things it highlighted was when you see that something says AAA, there's this okay, great, it's safe, I'm good. But when you looked at the underlying holdings of some of these, these were some of these were, pooled debt products that by argument of diversification have become safe. And there was something actually, and I've looked for this reference because I remember it so clearly. There was at one point something called a kitchen sink bond. And I think this was in the 70s or the 80s. And the idea was you just take a whole bunch of junk bonds, you put them in, you pull everything in, from the kitchen sink and dump it into a pot. And suddenly it's, a wonderful stew.
Right.
And this was actually, so when we repeated this cycle, that the kitchen sink bonds were from even before my time in the industry, but we repeated the cycle. And it's this idea of, people are so eager to come up with a way to put something together to make it better.
Right.
And, sometimes you can't get rid of the hair on the product, so to speak. And I think that you see a lot of, that's a common thing that people are doing, which is saying if we pull things together, it all looks better. And I do think that from a psychological perspective, we want things that look interesting to be good for us from an investment perspective. And I think we sometimes don't take the time to really look at what's underneath the hood, going back to the car analogy, but you don't look under the hood of what's in the underlying investment. And I think it's a common problem that we face in investing.
Yeah, and it really is. And I think you're right. It fundamentally cuts to the psychology of it, where somehow you want to believe. Right. It's not a mechanical issue. And I would argue on the mechanical side of things, to a man with a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. I think it is. Yeah. And as students of risk, yes, of course, it's hard to dispute that the concept of diversification and all this stuff has been a defining piece of knowledge in modern finance, certainly since the mid 50s, early 60s. It's not about the mechanics. We all understand if we have any kind of math background that you lump together a bunch of things that have imperfect correlation, and in theory the risk goes down. But again, the psychology is wanting to believe that that becomes foolproof. There's wanting the magic to be true on the kind of buyer side of things, because I think everybody wants to do something cool and exciting and different, and also not face the music when it comes to risk. And then this is a business. So somebody else on the other side says, with a little sprinkling of magic, I get to sell this thing. And it's...
Yeah. And the other thing I also wanted to add, and again, the timing on this is really perfect, which is I think that all of us who invest, the desire to get the timing right is so prevalent. And I always say when people are trying to, where's the bottom or where's the top? But we hear now more about where's the bottom. And I always say, and this is going to be for the math background on me, the second derivative is just as hard as the first. I can't tell you the direct, how far the market is going to move, nor can I tell you when it's going to reverse. And I really don't think there's anyone out there who actually knows. I think there's lots of people who have opinions, and there will be a person who times it, who names it perfectly, but the reality is nobody knows. And so I feel a lot of people have said to me like, oh, I wish I had sold a month ago. Yes, but you know what? You probably invested a year ago and you had a great 2024.
Right.
And just remember that. And it's not about, if anyone thinks that they're going to be selling every time there's just before a drop and then they're buying just before the rally, it's not a sustainable or even reasonable approach. The idea is to, invest in what you like, be prepared for an occasionally bumpy ride, and focus on where you want to be in 4 years, 10 years, whatever the time frame is. But this idea that you're buying and selling at these perfect moments is so unrealistic. And I think timing is often, it keeps people watching the markets on a daily basis, which is not helpful because there's so much randomness and noise and chaotic movement going on there, that removing yourself from that and just saying, I have a 5-year plan and this is what it is, and I'm going to take the volatility as it comes.
No, I think that's exactly right. And to your point about there's always someone who's going to look like a hero after the fact. Human nature is such that this never dies. One of my favorite piece of financial clickbait is always man who predicted Lehman now tells you what's going to happen next week.
Yes. Right.
And I'm like, there was always going to be a man who predicted Lehman.
So, yeah, and my guess is that man who predicted next week probably turned out not to be.
Right.
Correct.
I mean, again, there's so many of these. There's this thought experiment, right, where someone, and I guess this is kind of a pyramid scheme type of idea, where you send 100 letters out, and then you say half of them you predict the market's going to go up, the other half you predict the market's going to go down, and then you keep doing it, kind of cutting the sample in half, and then one person is going to have to receive
who's going to think you're a genius.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's all it took. So I know you have passions and things you do outside of thinking about markets that are important to you. I know you do mentoring. Do you want to tell me about that?
Sure. Yeah. And, look, this is one of the things I've really enjoyed since going out on my own as an independent consultant is that I have a little bit more flexibility in my time. And so, I've started tutoring young students here in New York City that are in the public schools. And this is through a nonprofit here in New York City called Goddard Riverside. They do a lot of things within, a lot of support services within New York, but they have a tutoring program. And, it's just been really wonderful to work with young people who, maybe have not had a lot of opportunities to sit with someone it's a 2-hour session once a week. And just sit and ask, like, how does this work? We've done logarithms, which I'm sure you studied, which are sometimes an incredibly unintuitive mathematical concept. And, I was recently working on that. And I said to my husband afterwards, I think she walked away with a much better understanding. I don't know if it was a perfect understanding, but a much better understanding. And we meet again the next week and we talk about other subjects. And what I really love seeing is, I brag about this. I have a student who, when I started with her, and she was in 9th grade and she was failing math.
Wow.
And last year, she got an A- in her math.
That's incredible. I mean, that really is making an impact.
It really made an impact, and I'm really proud of her. And she's graduating this year from high school, and it is nice. Is nice to see. And then, as you know, the typical. You see it a lot for people in finance. I started playing bridge more actively, really leading into COVID and then during COVID. It's a great game for someone who has a lot of free time. It's a big investment in time to learn to play bridge well, but it's been a really enjoyable experience. And then also, like a lot of people who like statistics, as I think I'm a big baseball fan.
Yes.
Yes, go Boston Red Sox. Not having a great start to the year, but hopefully that will turn around. But I love watching baseball because there's just so much statistics with it. How does this batter do against left-handed pitchers when there's 2 men on and I don't know, and it's a full moon, and you just get to think about all the permutations of how a game is played, which I really enjoy, and I actually find it relaxing to watch it.
Well, on the way out, I have a series of questions that I ask my guests that are derived from Bernard Pivot's literary TV show in France. So are you ready for a round of questions? Okay.
I'm ready.
What is your favorite word?
Maybe it counts as 2, but my favorite word would be thank you.
Oh, I love it.
Because, I think people don't use it enough. People appreciate someone thanking them for things they do. So,
what is your least favorite word?
My least favorite word. I think I'm probably going to use a phrase as opposed to a word, and I hear this too much in business, which is do more with less. I find that a really depressing phrase. I think I love the idea. I'm all about efficiency, but I'd rather be do more with efficiency, because less just means you're going to be working hard.
Yeah.
So I really encourage people not to use that phrase.
All right. The next one I think is an easy one for you. What is your favorite drug?
My favorite beverage, my favorite everything is coffee. I
Lots
don't
and
know
lots of it.
black coffee. So, iced coffee, hot coffee, both are good.
Is there one coffee that you would turn down?
Room temperature or coffee with milk. For me, milk adds a bitterness that I don't like, so I never drink coffee with milk.
Interesting. What sound or noise do you love?
Do I love? I love the sound of the ocean. I really do. When I was a kid, we vacationed in Maine along the coast, and I just remember, but it's so soothing, and that the steadiness of it, I just love hearing it. I don't hear it much here in New York City.
I know. I mean, I will tell you this, and again, there's much I miss about New York, but living in California and living, minutes away from the ocean, where our regular weekend walks are along the Pacific, and just hearing the waves crashing is just so soothing. I am with you 100%. What sound or noise do you hate?
Okay, well, this will be a New York sound. I really hate the sound of the sirens here in New York. I wish someone could do something about it, because I drive in New York City, and you never know where the sirens are coming from. So I don't think it's not providing enough information, giving the ping that it comes.
Right. What is your favorite curse word?
Yeah, let me think. I have worked on trading desks several times, so I'm quite familiar with words, and I've used them myself quite a bit. I guess, I would have to say probably it's probably shit, because I think you can use it in all sorts of forms.
Love it.
So,
who would you like to see on a new banknote?
on a new banknote, I mean, I'd love to see a woman on a banknote, but I don't know if I could name someone offhand who I think has risen to that level yet today. So I think my answer is I don't think I can name someone.
Well, I get it. I think we should be holding everybody, man or woman, to extremely high standards. Yeah. What profession other than your own would you not like to attempt?
I would never want to be in politics. I just don't think I could tolerate what's the right word? The inconsistency is probably good. So, I just don't see myself as a politician.
And yet we need people with high standards, Katie. If you were reincarnated as a plant or an animal, what would it be?
Yeah, that's an easy one. I tell many people this. I really hope I come back as a domesticated cat. Ideally in a nice apartment in New York City. Or maybe with a little garden where I can chase some mice. But maybe after a busy career, the idea of lounging in the sun and catching the occasional mouse sounds sort of appealing.
Seems pretty good.
So, yeah.
All right, I love it. Our last one. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the pearly gates?
I'd like to hear him say thank you.
Well, Katie, it was wonderful to have you. And let me use your two favorite words, because I mean them from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. It was wonderful to have you.
You're very welcome, and I appreciate it. I really enjoyed our conversation.
This podcast is for entertainment and education only. Nothing here is financial advice. Treussard Capital Management is a registered investment advisor. Please visit our website, w.treussard.com, for additional information and disclaimers.